Good evening, dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, I welcome all of you to today's very important webinar titled Bridging Communities Tackling Rising Antisemitism Globally and Locally. We gather today on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the enduring importance of respect, understanding, and unity among diverse communities. The audience, today's webinar comes at a very critical moment. Anti Semitism is not a new phenomenon, but its resurgence in recent years, both globally and locally, demands our urgent attention. I thought it is prudent to remind our audience about the definition of anti Semitism according to International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which says, I quote, a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Unquote. This definition provides a framework for understanding the hate we are seeing today, which manifests in both overt and subtle ways. The recent incident in Winnipeg, where anti Semitic graffiti was sprayed on a community center, is a stark reminder of the local realities of this hate. On January 14, 2025, Winnipeg police arrested an individual who is only 19 for defacing a community center with hateful symbols and messages targeting Jewish community. This act of vandalism not only damaged property but also deeply impacted the sense of safety and belonging for Jewish residents here. Like Avram Sharak, who is one of our panelists today, many members of Winnipeg Jewish community has been vocal about the emotional toll such incidents take, emphasizing that anti-Semitism is not just an abstract issue, but a lived reality for many. The audience, globally, the situation is equally alarming. Meanwhile, the rise of extremist ideologies, such as those propagated by the graffiti group like MKY, highlights how nihilism and online radicalization are defining terrorism recruitment and mass violence. MKY, which stands for Maniac Murder Cult, is an infamous online movement that glorifies chaos, destruction, and hate. Their ideology, rooted in nihilism and antisocial extremism, has inspired acts of violence and vandalism worldwide, including here in Winnipeg. MKY's influence has spread through online platforms where vulnerable youth are radicalized by their messages of despair and hatred. This group's followers' presence in Winnipeg is a troubling example of how global extremist movements can take root locally, exploiting social divisions and targeting communities. The aftermath of October 7 attack in Israel has further exacerbated social polarization, with Jewish communities worldwide facing increased hostility and blame for conflicts far beyond everyone's control. This polarization has created fertile ground for extremist ideologies to flourish, making it even more critical to address the root causes of hate and radicalization. The audience, some of you might be aware that here in Manitoba, we are taking proactive steps to combat extremism through initiatives like Extremism and Radicalization to Violence Prevention in Manitoba, in short ERIM. This initiative, funded by Public Safety Canada, focuses on preventing youth from being drawn into extremist ideologies by addressing the underlying factors that make them vulnerable, such as social isolation, mental health challenges, and online exposure to hate. Dear audience, we are absolutely privileged today that in this above context, our panelists today will bring invaluable perspectives to this discussion. We are absolutely honored to have with us two policymakers, both from federal and provincial level, one educator, and one community leader in this discussion. Let me introduce and welcome all of them in one by one. Member of Parliament, Winnipeg South Centre, Mr. Ben Carr, who has been a strong advocate for combating hate and fostering community cohesion, is our first guest who will speak first. Ben, welcome to the show and the studio. How are you, sir?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And always nice to share a panel with my friends Avram, Mike, and Bell, all individuals who, in their own right, have been taking it upon themselves not only to fight anti Semitism and hate of all kinds, but to use the moment and the challenges that we face in our country and around the world to bring people together. And I think that that's really at the essence and the core of what it is that we need to accomplish. Um, I remember growing up. My father told me a lot of stories, and many of them stuck with me. But one in particular was when he was about 13 or 14 years old and playing outside the Crescentwood Community Center, which is in a riding that I now represent, and being beat up pretty badly outside of that community center simply because he was Jewish. And it was through both stories like that passed on directly from family members, in addition to understanding our own ancestry, what brought us to Canada in the first place. In my case, and that's true for many Jews, particularly in Western Canada, was the pogroms of Eastern Europe in the 18th and 1800s and 1900s, which drove people out of their homes and needing to find new places to settle, and Western Canada was one that had the door open to many Jews from that part of the world. But we also learned about the treatment of Jews through scripture, through the high holidays when we get together, for example, and learn about the experiences that have taken place in Egypt, in ancient history, and in other places where Jews, I think, have always grown up with this sense that they have had to be very practical and aware and united in the face of anti-Semitism, which is certainly not new. The modern age of anti-Semitism, I would argue, Dr. Ahmed, brings about very different challenges. I would say, in brief, there are kind of three or four things, because when I asked you who the primary audience was, you told me that we ought to be directing our attention to educators in particular. I myself am a former educator, was very proud to be a social studies and history teacher in high school. I went on to be a high school principal after that, and my degrees are in Canadian history and Canadian political science. So it's something I've thought about for a long time. I'm mindful of a quote that Murray Sinclair, who we sadly lost very recently, was fond of using in the context of the residential school legacy here in Canada, but I think is very relevant to a variety of the ways in which we combat hate, and that would be inclusive of anti-Semitism as well. And Murray was very fond of saying that education got us into this mess, education will get us out of this mess. And education doesn't necessarily have to be in a formal sense. Anti-Semitism does not necessarily have to be generated in the hallways of a school. It can be something that is learned at home. It can be something that's learned in a community center. And increasingly, of course, it's something that's being learned online. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to educate. There are very disturbing surveys that are telling us in recent days that the degree of Holocaust denialism is substantially increasing in Canada, not just around the world, but in Canada specifically. And we are seeing percentages sometimes in the 20 to 25% range of people who are saying that they believe that the Holocaust was exaggerated. The 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which was commemorated just a week ago, I hope serves as an opportunity for us to recommit to the important work of ensuring that history is not forgotten. But education is a critical component of that, and it's something that can be done for children at a very young age, all the way to adults who perhaps have lived most of their life with a false sense of who the Jewish people are, or what it means to be Jewish, or how we interact with Jewish community members. There is a way in which education plays a role in all of this. The second thing I would suggest is that it's very important that we're not silent about this. I attended, as did others on this call earlier this week, a very interesting and I think important discussion at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, led by an Australian scholar and expert on online anti-Semitism, who was talking about the practical ways in which we can contribute to finding remedies to the problem. And one of those things is to make sure that we don't stay silent. But I can appreciate at the same time how difficult that is to navigate. Mike can probably speak to this as well, but there are times where I would very much like to say something about anti-Semitism or conflicts going on in the world, only to find that my social media platforms just become a breeding ground for hate. So politicians, I think, are wrestling with, as are other leaders, this decision of, do I try to engage, or am I actually creating a space online where I'm making it worse? And it's not so straightforward to know whether or not that is the best space for us to be engaging in this conversation, but there's no question that we have to have a presence in the online sphere. The last thing I would say, Dr. Ahmed, is that we have to ask questions. One of the things I know when I was a teacher and the country was starting to awaken again, I'm going to use the example of residential schools and this journey of truth and reconciliation that we're on, is that a lot of young teachers then, and I believe still, weren't sure how to raise the issues in the classroom. They were scared of the questions they might get. They weren't sure, were they going to get in trouble for saying the wrong thing in a response? I've always believed as an educator that one of the most important things that we can do and that we can encourage students to do is to be curious and to ask questions. So we have to create spaces where we allow people the ability to think out loud without the possibility that if we can ascertain, which I think we often can, that the questions are coming from an authentic and genuine place where people are trying to get better, they're trying to learn, they're trying to understand, that we are not too quick to judge, we are not too quick to dismiss, but that we work together with this common objective of making sure that we are building unity, and that curiosity is a very important mechanism within the education process of getting us to that point. So, so far as my introductory remarks are concerned, I would say that those are kind of 3 or 4 areas in particular vis-a-vis the education sphere, and just more broadly speaking for people in the community, that we ought to be mindful of as we are collectively trying to address the ever-growing challenge around anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Mr. Ben, for your, I think, a very well-rounded discussion on the issues that we are confronting here. The audience, Mr. Ben might have to leave us to attend one important session later this evening. But before he leaves, I just would like to also request him to comment about the situation that he sees from a bigger perspective from Ottawa. So do you think that we should have a national policy with regards to education? And then how do you navigate these things? And you are very rightly posed the question that it is getting difficult in today's situation, even to engage with the topic through social media. Do you think so? There should be a policy on this matter?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about a policy in relation to something vis-a-vis education, as you know, the domain of education rests within the jurisdiction of provincial governments and territorial governments in Canada. Having said that, that doesn't mean that the federal government can't take advantage of its vast networks by being a convener. There have been and there will be very soon in the near future important discussions about anti-Semitism and how we combat it. The important thing is that we bring people together. We have to have provincial ministers of education. We have to have teachers. We have to have school board trustees. We have to have elected officials. We have to have people like Bell and Avram, people such as yourself, have to be engaged in this conversation. I don't think that the goal necessarily needs to be to relitigate some of the work that groups like IRA have done already, where it can be very difficult to come up with definitions, and definitions can be controversial. Of course, they're very useful in helping to play a guiding role in our understanding of how to frame this conversation. But I think sometimes we fall victim to trying to come up with very concise and specific, agreed upon releases or memos or policies, which sometimes actually distract us from the foundational work, which is really just about making sure that we create a higher degree of understanding. Aside from the educational component, I think where we do need to be more proactive, and it's a more complicated conversation and more convoluted, but that has to do, of course, with the way in which we enforce and we look at hate speech laws in this country. Unfortunately, right now, with what's happening around the world, but domestically, the prorogation of Parliament has in part meant that the Online Harms Act, which the government, alongside our colleagues in the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, and some conservatives, depending on who you talk to, have been interested in advancing a really meaningful and relevant set of policy directives that will help to deal with it. So you simultaneously, two things have to be happening. One is the education component, making sure that we're starting to help create more understanding and stymie the increase of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, for that matter. However, at the same time, we have to be stronger in terms of our community response to anti-Semitism when it happens. And it's very difficult not only to enforce hate laws for some reasons, but it's also difficult to construct hate speech laws, because you have to find a very delicate balance between the values of freedom of expression that we hold dear in this country and that are protected by the Charter versus the realistic, problematic reality that there are violent acts and non-violent acts that are causing significant harm to the Jewish community across the country. So figuring out how within a national policy at the federal level we deal with that, while at the same time we work in partnership with municipalities and provincial governments and organizations and leaders like Bell and Avram and Mike, that is, I think, how we in a more wholesome and well-rounded way deal with that national component that you were asking about.
Thank you, sir, very much for your time. And I think we have got the gist of your, deliberation today about the problems of on one side, our freedom of speech and expression versus how to enforce hate laws. And I think this is very pertinent today. The audience, let me welcome now our member of Legislative Assembly from River Heights, Mike Moros, to the discussion. I think it's a good segue because education is always a provincial, jurisdiction and portfolio. So we would listen very carefully now from our MLA and his thoughts in the community. How does he see this kind of hate and what we should do to combat it? Mr. Mike, welcome once again to the studio.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share this discussion with three of my friends who I work very closely with on this issue, as well as other matters. I think Ben has put the frame on the discussion very well. And so rather than retrace some of those steps, I'm going to concentrate, I think, on four areas that relate specifically to the work that I'm able to do as a provincial legislature. Ben rightly identified Murray Sinclair's thoughtful words around the value of education on these sorts of matters. And I'm very proud to say that they're working with Bell and others in the community, that our government has moved to bring in compulsory Holocaust education for K-12 here in Manitoba. It's an important part of the work that needs to be done around this issue and hate across the board, frankly. I know that the excellent work that Bell has done, along with the people in the ministry, people like Kelly Hebert, really setting up students to understand not just the historical context in which those particular events occurred, but how hate, how anti-Semitism, how it has morphed into so many other things in a modern and technological age, and how there are other examples as well of hate that also need to be addressed. And so I think they've done an excellent job in terms of setting the stage for what will be, I think, a first-rate educational experience for Manitoba students. So looking at that piece, governments do have a responsibility to make sure they take the education piece seriously, that they give teachers the tools they require to do that successfully, and provide them with the training too. I spent a long time as a teacher, and every now and then you'd get a new initiative come through the classroom, and you were very intimidated at first whether or not you were qualified to even teach it. And so it's critically important we have professional development in place as well, so that teachers are able to deliver that thoughtful programming, that important programming, in the way that it was intended. Um, Ben also raised the fact that we need to think about how we're going to respond when we see incidents of hate and anti-Semitism in our community. How do we now respond to that? How do we make it clear that that sort of behavior is unacceptable? And again, at the provincial level, because that's our responsibility, we've stepped up and brought in a special hate crimes prosecutor. It's a clear signal to not just to the Jewish community, but to all communities who are targets of hate. Um, uh, Islamophobia is a growing problem, as well as are attacks against the LGBTQ community. Anyone who might experience that needs to know that when violent incidents, when racist incidents, when anti-Semitism occurs, governments take that very seriously and deal with it in a clear and concise way. And so we're very pleased to have stepped up on that as well. I was one of the guests Ben was referring to at the seminar run by Bell, frankly, the other day at the Human Rights Museum with Professor Obler from Australia. And he talked about the work he's doing around identifying anti-Semitism online, and just the sheer volume of it. And as I sat there in the audience watching, his work, watching him talk about his work, I was reminded that I'm also the Minister of Innovation and New Technology, and social media and the work that's being done online by big tech companies. That's part of my responsibility. And as he was walking through and talking about things that can be done, I was making a little check mark. So, geez, that's my department. Yeah, that's my department too. Oh dear, that's also my department. So there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do in terms of how we consider guardrails for things like social media. I mean, the argument is always, well, you can't possibly regulate the internet. Well, no, we probably can't and probably don't want to, but we do need a clear set of guardrails about what is and is not acceptable online. It is deeply troubling too, as we consider the work of Mr. Obler. What's coming out of big tech companies in the United States right now? We've seen the transformation of Twitter to X, what it's become, the sorts of speech that occurs there now. We see now Facebook make the transformation. They're no longer going to provide fact checking. It's become very much the Wild West, and governments do have to pay attention. Educators have to pay attention to the environment that the young people are engaging with there, to make sure that they understand what it is they're engaging with, right? That kind of literacy, that media literacy, has to be part of our educational process as well. And then finally, I don't want to take up too much time from either the other guests or from your audience. I do think we have to pay very clear attention here moving forward to the social determinants of anti-Semitism and racism and hatred. I think it becomes easy, and we see it again in the United States. We see how easy it is for people to say, the problems you're having in your life, it's the fault of that particular group there. Um, and people who are feeling vulnerable, who are feeling as though their employment might be limited, like the opportunities they have to get ahead might be less. Um, they're susceptible to that, and so I think governments have to pay very clear attention to making sure that the wealth of the nation is shared across the nation, so people are inoculated against that kind of stuff. There's no need for me to worry about someone else because my family is secure. The opportunities that my country presents me are open to me. And so making sure people understand that, and we're working with them to secure those opportunities as such an important part of our work as well. So I think with those sort of initial comments, I'll leave it there. I'm anxious to hear what the others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think very important points that you reminded us about social determinants. I think as a student in conflict and justice studies, we do appreciate the weight of this term and how it really creates social conflicts. And then you find one escape group to put a blame on it. So thank you very much, Mike. And being our minister in our province, and we do have high hopes that we will work together in combating those things in our province. The audience, let me welcome now our friend Belle here to the discussion. She's always in the forefront, and actually, she was helping us since 2021. We first started our federal project, ERIM, and we do go back to her for seeking her advice in educational matters. So, without further ado, Belle, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to respond also to some of the things that have been said and provide a little more information. Certainly, professional development and training for teachers is so important. This is a difficult subject, and one has to be comfortable in teaching it. And while students sometimes bring negative beliefs from their homes, so do teachers as well. And so we will actually be releasing this information this coming week, that the Jewish Heritage Center, in partnership with the Azrieli Survivor Memoirs Program, is going to be offering a full-day professional development program for teachers on May 13th. And in order to facilitate teachers being able to come, the Azrieli Foundation is going to be providing 50% of the cost of substitutes for that day. When we talk about education is so important, and we're so thrilled that the late Minister Altomar was so quick to accept our proposal for a mandated program. But when we talk about a program of Holocaust education, we know that if just teaching about the era from 1933 to 1945, and when we're talking about Canada and immigration, really going even later, that's not enough just in itself. That a part of that program also has to be learning about who Jews are, because there is so much ignorance out there. People think that all Jews are white, when in fact, in Israel, for instance, the majority of Jews are not, and that we come from many different backgrounds, etc., different social economic levels as well, but also the history of anti-Semitism, because it is the longest hatred, and it continues like a disease to mutate. And it's not always recognized. And I not only speak to students about anti-Semitism, which is really most of what I have been doing lately in the area of education, but I've been speaking to adult professional groups as well. And I think that this was something that Dr. Obalor really made clear, that often we don't recognize anti-Semitism when we see it, particularly on social media. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of broader knowledge about history in itself, the history of anti-Semitism, the history of the world, of World War I, World War II, And that's a problem, because in Manitoba today, one could go through high school, and while it is absolutely very important to learn our own history about Canada, unless one chooses to take a course in, for instance, global issues, one could go all the way through high school without learning anything about global history. And this is a real problem. Um, we, as Dr. Oblor pointed out, we are seeing an explosion of hate online. And often I'm asked what I think the reason for that is. And so I think part of this is we had a few years of COVID where people were sitting at home and spending a lot of time on social media in their own echo chambers. And with this, coupled with this lack of knowledge, people are picking up all kinds of really dangerous beliefs, ideologies, becoming radicalized, as you know, Kauser. And it is also so much easier to say really hateful things when you're not face to face with a person. When you meet a person and you get to know them, it's not so easy to just express, these things. But it is on social media. And so we now have several years of people being accustomed to this. But as you say, you talk about coming to school with ideas from home. I know that, we see thousands of students each year. And very sadly, from time to time, I will come across students who will, very comfortably express something, for instance, very anti-Semitic, such as, how could such a thing as the Holocaust have occurred? How could people turn against their friends and their neighbors so easily? And I remember one middle school child eagerly raising his hand and saying, because the Jews were sitting on all the money. And this is not something that he would have learned in school, of course. Between that and all of the conspiracy theories that are roiling around us, we have a real problem. So we do need, I think, to educate both teachers and students, but we also need to look to a more general educational program for the broader public as well, in order to combat anti-Semitism. I agree also that we need to speak out, as Dr. Oblor said. We cannot be silent, and we need to make sure that people understand what anti-Semitism is. And there I go back to the IRA definition, because it is the most accepted definition in the world. It is the only intergovernmental definition, and one that our country and our province has accepted, a legally non-binding definition, and very, very useful. And now we have, very proudly, our Canadian handbook, which puts the various pieces of the definition into a Canadian context and provides examples that have happened here in Canada. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Belle. Thank you so much. I think it's very important to reflect upon Belle's some of the comments. Dear audience, we live in a society and we interact with other groups every waking hours of our lives. So this is important, that education is only one sector, but rather as a society, we have to really come up with a better solution to deal with anti-Semitism and hatred that is so endemic in today's world. And at the end of our next guest speech, I will also reflect upon how this online thing can go into offline and express itself in real-time attack on groups, because we have seen it so many times, especially in the US, in Europe. So, dear audience, without further ado, let me also welcome our special guest today, Avram Sharak. And he was featured, I think, on January 14th, if I'm not wrong, in CBC. And he is one of the persons in our city who has taken upon himself to erase graffitis. And according to the news, and we'll listen more intently now, he has removed more than 100 pieces of graffitis all across Winnipeg. What a remarkable effort. And I kind of title it as One Man's War Against Graffiti and Hate. So, the audience, let me listen. Let me welcome and listen to Avram now. Avram, floor is yours, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, and I'm truly honored to be part of this panel. A little humbled. I started taking graffiti off quite by mistake, and we'll get there in a moment. But I'm going to tie into something that Ben said right near the beginning because it reminded me of an incident I was personally involved in. I was in grade 4 or 5 at the Jewish private school. We had just attended grade 6 graduation, and a bunch of us went to the playground across the street. Now, as background, I lived a block away from the school. Some neighborhood kids came and they started to pick on people. And one of them came towards me, and the other one said, "No, no, no, he's okay. He's our neighbor. He's not a Jew." Like, I'm a Jew, but I'll take that. So I quickly ran into the school and got some adults who took care of suggesting to those young children that it's inappropriate to be beating up on Jewish kids in front of the Jewish school. But that also ties into what Bell said, actually, as well, and Mike, the social determinants, right? Because they knew me, because I played on the same playground as them. I wasn't a bad Jew. Well, I wasn't really any different than any of the kids in that playground. I mean, there were some bad kids, but we're not going that way. But that's the key, right? We're all people. People are people. And blind hatred comes from, lack of knowledge. So again, it ties into what's been said before. So let me get a little bit to why I know you had me here, as you call it, my battle against, or my war against graffiti. I'll say a little bit about that, and I'll say just a little bit about what I think has to change. So by day, I'm a property manager, happen to be a CPA, and I've apparently become a little radicalized, which is why I'm wearing my End Jew Hatred t-shirt today. Jew hatred, by the way, for those who are educators who don't know this, is probably the more appropriate way to define anti-Semitism these days. Because anti-Semitism, as Bell could tell you, was coined, and it's a rather antiseptic term. It really is hating Jews. That's what anti-Semitism is. And I've gotten involved in an organization called that. So in mid-May, on one of the groups that I think Bell's a part of as well, one of the discussion groups in the Jewish community on WhatsApp, everybody does those things these days, someone had posted a photograph, and this may or may not have been seen in the media, and it may be hard to see here, but the one with Jews kill babies with the SS at the end. A lot of our people got very upset, and I don't blame them. I was a little upset too. What do we do? What do we do? I said, has anybody reported to the police? Yes. People were like, I said, leave it there for a bit. They'll come get rid of it. But people were getting more hot under the collar. So I said, you know what? I got the equipment at the office. I'll have one of my coworkers. It was after work on a Friday. Meet me there, and anybody who wants to come can come and watch. And some people came and watched, and we removed this graffiti. And lo and behold, within days, I was getting texts, phone calls, LinkedIn messages. I got a LinkedIn message recently, and phone calls from all sorts of places. And you know what? I don't love having to take off the graffiti, but every time I remove a little bit more hate from the world, it makes me feel a little better. And I've run into a whole bunch of people. I usually go out, not by myself. It's not one man in that sense. Almost every time I take a friend with me. Partly they take pictures, partly they watch my back, literally, just in case. I've had no, thank God, negative interaction. The most negative interaction was when I spent 3 hours walking from Main Street to Princess, from Notre Dame to William, during the Fringe Festival with one of my friends, removing graffiti for almost 3 hours straight. We did take a short break to have a bite to eat at the Fringe. And that was my most negative interaction. I was in front of one of the venues, and the spray I use has an odor to it. It's a little bit like nail polish remover. So I spray on, I wipe off, or I spray on, I brush, and then I wipe off, or whatever. And someone there said, "Oh, that stinks." I said, "I'm sorry." They said, "No, no, no, don't worry about it. We appreciate what you're doing." That was the most negative reaction I've had so far. Thank God. I was expecting, especially some of the places, a couple of places I've taken 2 friends with me because of the kind of places most Winnipeggers don't want to go. But yes, I have cleaned up graffiti all the way from east of the river in the north end, west of the river in the north end, Charleswood, River Heights, Tuxedo, downtown, the granola belt, as they call it, the west end, all over the city. It's sad. And anecdotally, and I'm wearing an anecdotal lens, being a Jewish person, I may not be paying as much attention to other hate, but from that approximately 100, 150, it's hard to keep track. Sometimes you clean up one. I had over 50, plus about 10 stickers I took off that one night at the Fringe Festival. I've seen literally less than 10 other offensive, racist, or whatever you want to call it, graffiti tags in that time personally. And they were all either against Indigenous or people of African heritage. Not sure that's the right politically correct term to use these days, but you get what I'm saying. So really, the statistics out there talk about the reports of anti-Semitism exceed 50%. Some people say up to 70% of the reports received by government and the police. And we're like 1% of Canada's population, maybe even less. We get a fair bit more attention than one would expect. And then some of these other groups who say we get a lot of hate, I don't deny they get a lot of hate, and they should get none. But then they complain the Jews complain too much. Well, we're not complaining. As a matter of fact, we're complaining a lot less. I didn't really want to be known for being a graffiti remover, not because I'm worried about people getting mad at me, but because I was doing it for myself and my community. But when it was put to me by first the Winnipeg Sun, who did a piece on me, I think in November, that I was forced to do by a friend of mine who's good friends with the publisher, and then CBC, that they were going to feature getting rid of hate. And that's what I wanted, because I'm not important. I'm just one person trying to clean up a little bit. There's probably a lot of other people doing things like that. But it's getting rid of the hate, and this, again, I didn't use my color pictures, but this is the ones we're talking about, the MKY graffiti. And the one that's most famous would be the one on the Jewish synagogue. A little less famous is that one from inside one of Winnipeg's middle schools. I think Mike's seen all of these because I believe I sent a whole bunch of photos to you with one of the rabbis when they came to meet with you, Mike. So now let me just, in a couple of minutes, talk about what I think really needs to be done, what's being done well, and what's being done very poorly. I'm going to start at the top. I really believe, and it's a shame because I wish Ben were here to hear this, although I've said it to him before, I really believe the federal government dropped the ball on this. They should have been a little tougher at the beginning. When you have people climbing hospitals that just happen to have Jewish names and screaming anti-Semitic chants and waving flags that they say are pro-Palestinian, but they're really, why are they doing it on a Jewish hospital or a hospital with a name that's Jewish in the country Canada? What did the hospital do to anyone aside from save people's lives as compared to, as the graffiti says, kill babies? So I think they were a little too slow on the uptake. And there's a lot of room for improvement federally. Provincially, slower than I would have wanted. I would have wanted day one. But the point is they have put in place a special prosecutor. They have paid a lot of attention to us, to the Jewish community. And I'm kind of an unofficial leader in the Jewish community these days. I'm not in charge of anything at the moment, which allows me actually to be a little more vocal because I don't have to be as politically correct as I would if I were an official leader at the moment. But that's important. Things like having a special prosecutor. And let the special prosecutor go after someone who's espousing Islamophobia. Everybody should be treated fairly. But it's just important having that there. The Holocaust curriculum, the late Nello Altemeyer and I had a conversation with Kelly Ebert. And I said, this can't be a Holocaust curriculum. This has to be, for the sake of argument, 50% Holocaust and 50% everything else, the Holodomor, the potato famines, everything. Critical thinking. I think Mike was the first person to talk about that tonight. And I have a friend who's a school principal in one of the largest schools in Winnipeg, and he and I have had that conversation. And this one's for the provincial government. There's not necessarily enough leeway, although this curriculum is going to give it, to teach students this. Because my friend said to me not long after October 7th, I wish I could even talk about it in my school, but I'm not allowed to talk about it because, just they got a church and state kind of stuff. And it's not that this friend who's not Jewish wants to take sides. He wants to tell the kids, think critically. Don't just look at one TikTok that says Jews are colonial settlers in Israel and I have over 20 family members in Israel. We're of Ashkenazi heritage, Eastern European, but with the exception of one of my nieces and nephews, 4 of them have married people who are not Eastern European. They're African or Sephardi. So yes, as Bell said, I think it's 57% or 67% of the Jewish Israelis in Israel are not white. And guess what? Israel was Judea when Jesus was born. And the Quran calls Israel the home of the Jews. But these people come out and say Jews never were there. And people believe it because they're not critically thinking or being taught. So kudos for the curriculum. And then I guess the final thing is, well, 2 final things. The media, they just allow people, any people, they allow me to say what I say without challenging me. I'm not going to lie. But they allow the kind of talk I was just talking about to be said by people. And they don't even say, but wasn't Jesus born in Judea, as an example? Just that one comment alone would let people say, oh, we have to think critically, not just accept that, because it's out there. Jesus was a Palestinian. Well, Palestine as a name didn't exist when he was born. And you hear 20-year-olds saying this because they think it's factual. And it's not the fault of the 20-year-old. I mean, it is to some degree, but it's not the fault of the 20-year-old. It's the fault of not being taught to think critically and not having people in the media challenge when comments are made. I was listening to Hard Talk on Friday morning at 5:30 in the morning at my office, and they had on a representative of Hamas, which makes my skin crawl when these people are on the radio. But the Hard Talk host, when they said certain things, Hamas said, but what about? And of course, they avoided the questions. And they've done the same thing to Israeli guests and guests from all over the world in Hard Talk. Why doesn't the media do that? And finally, and this one is getting in my craw, because I've noticed recently that a national museum located in Winnipeg has been hosting a lot of events that don't provide critical thought and are one-sided. And it concerns me that the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, when we've brought to their attention a number of people from our community, that they should question why there's events that spout the kind of Jew hate that I'm talking about there, don't either have a sign up saying this is one-sided or say you can't do pure hate as an event. Kudos to the event on the Holocaust. I couldn't get there this week. But that's, one exception in the storm.
Sorry, it wasn't an event on the Holocaust. It was an event on online hate.
Oh, I'm sorry about
online anti-Semitism. Sorry.
That's my miss. But the point is, it was appropriate. And it wasn't blaming someone else. It was teaching. And that's the important thing. A lot of these other events blame people. And sorry, I get a little emotional when it comes to Jew hatred, having grown up feeling it. And having lived in Israel during a time that was very different but similar to this, when I, as a 16-year-old Canadian boy, was being shot at, not literally me shot at, but where I was living, missiles and everything, simply because I was there, the 1982 war. So I think that's, we have to look at federal, provincial, provinces doing a good job, feds could do more. We have to look at media and question media. And we have to look, unfortunately, at the Canadian Museum, who we've opened conversations with as a Jewish community, and hopefully will improve. And thank you for the time.
Thank you, Avram. Thank you. What a beautiful way of sharing your stories. Folks, we don't have much time for the next part, but I do have 2 questions, one for our Minister Mike and one for Bell before we end the session. So first question goes to Mike. As a minister, Mike, what do you think we should do next? And I want sort of your response based on 2 things. One, you have already referred how to tackle the social determinants, which is changing. For the lack of better word here, it's evolving, in each time. And second thing is, with regards to critical thinking and fostering these ideas of discussions at the societal level, do you have any plan as a policymaker in the future?
Those are both great, great questions. In terms of the social determinants, one of the things that I'm most proud of our government's only been in 18 months or so. One of the most important things we've done on the social determinants pathway is, in fact, institute a universal school nutrition program, right? Starting to make sure that kids, when they come to school, uh, get the nutrition they need, or at least some of the nutrition they need to have better educational outcomes, right? And what we know as part of that is that there are lots of examples across the province where attendance is much improved, specifically because there's food when people get there, right? And so um, sometimes it's not always what you think it is that's going to help shift the dial or improve the social determinants that then reduces the likelihood that someone's going to be susceptible to um, these sorts of things. Um, so that's certainly one of them, addressing the poverty, addressing that sort of stuff. I think we also need to have a hard look um, at the sorts of opportunities we provide people after they finish public school as well. Um, Ensuring that people we identify early for people where their passions might be, and try and get them on a pathway, in employment terms. Make a career out of your passion. The more we can do to work with people to get them an appropriate path in a healthy way, after having a solid education, the better off they're going to be. But I want to double back too to something that I think all of the other panelists have said, and that's about relationships. I mean, it all comes down directly to relationships. I grew up in a farming community in northern Alberta, and there weren't any Jewish people in my farming community, right? So it wasn't really until I got to university and started to meet people from a much broader cross section of society that I first got to know people in the Jewish community. Um, and I think that's important. We have to find ways to connect people within our community in a meaningful way, give them an opportunity to get to know each other better, uh, knowing full well that those relationships are the foundation of a strong, stable, and loving community. The more we know each other, the better off we all are, right? So I think that's critically important. I'm lucky in River Heights. I have a really vibrant, active, engaged community that wants to get together and do those sorts of things. And there are all sorts of opportunities here for people to engage in that way. Um, and now I'm going to need you to remind me what the other question was.
So, what we all are curious to know if your government has some policies moving forward
Oh,
in terms
right.
of, yeah.
There's discussions going on all the time. It's a question of how do we provide that appropriate balance. Certainly within my own ministry, as I said earlier, I'm going to, being in charge of data services, being in charge of AI policy, being in charge of cybersecurity. We're looking very seriously at what we can do to put some guardrails on the tech space. How do we work in that space to try and reduce the rise of anti-Semitism, of hate of all descriptions that we see there? It's as Bell rightly identified. If you don't have to own the words you're spewing out, it's so much easier just to say whatever comes off the top of your head in a stream of consciousness. Uh, People need to know that they're responsible for those things, and more importantly, in some respects too, the companies who post that material need to know it's their responsibility to monitor it and get it down as soon as it's identified as existing. So all of those things are on the table.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Bell, a quick question to you before we close. Of course, I'm coming back to Avram with one more question finally. But Bell, as an educator and as an activist, I would say you are in the forefront dealing with this hatred in our society. So, if we ask you in one line, what would you say we should immediately start doing? I mean, we have all these activities going on. Even I joined the workshop, and I learned myself so much about these social media posts. So these online things that we all are exposed to nowadays, unfortunately, even if we don't want. So what do you think we should do with regards to stopping the online coming into the offline and actual violence in our society?
I mean, I think this actually would involve, both Mike and Ben. I think we need a public program of making people aware about anti-Semitism and what it is, because I think that the majority of people really don't know. And while it's very important to begin in schools, I think we need public programming as well. And I think that was also something that Dr. Obalor mentioned. And maybe we could bring the province and the federal government into that, but certainly starting with our own province, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Bell, so much. Avram, coming back, circling back to you as a last with my last question. So, Avram, as a community activist and one of the prominent leader in your community, what do you see in the future with regards to the relationship with other communities, especially post October 7th? What are your hopes and fears?
Well, I have to give a shout out to the Asper Foundation. They've been doing a program where they're getting different groups within the Jewish community to have Shabbat, Sabbath dinner with other groups. So my synagogue, I'm past president of my synagogue, just had dinner a couple of weeks ago with the Sikh community. We learned a lot more about them. They learned a lot more about us. And part of my background, by the way, I'm a past president of Folklorama. So I'm acutely aware of learning about other cultures and getting rid of hate. So coining a term that the Mayor Bowman said at one time, we need more Folklorama all across Canada. And I don't literally mean the festival. I mean getting communities together, as Bell said, a public education campaign. It doesn't have to be only about anti-Semitism. It can certainly be about all cultures. And I will tie it back to one story I use when I talk to people about Folklorama's education side, and I'm not advertising here in that sense, but there was one school in the city of Winnipeg where a certain group of children came in. There was an immigration, and their food smelled funny and looked funny, and they looked funny and whatever. And there were some problems at the school. So the school called up Folklorama. They sent out people from that community. At that time, it was called Teachings. And they went in and they explained why people ate certain foods there and why they wore certain clothes. The school was much happier after that. Just that little bit of education, the students started to understand it wasn't stinky, ugly food, it was cultural food. And there was a reason for it, right? I'm not going to get into what community it was, but certain communities eat more fish because they're by the water. Certain eat more kinds of meat because of whatever. Certain avoid meat because of whatever. So I think we do need more public education at all levels, and we need people to get together, different communities. And I think that will help a lot.
Thank you so much, distinguished panelist. We are absolutely privileged to have you this evening with us, and I'm sure this very humble effort from our institute would be enable bringing knowledge to the greater society at large. And we're also so happy today to have with us Minister Mike Morrows, who is a policymaker, and we have just heard his ideas and his government's efforts in dealing with these social issues. From Bell, who is also the lead person in Jewish Heritage Center, she suggested public program because the issue of hatred should be dealt comprehensively by all, because we all live in this society. We all are part of this beautiful mosaic of our activities, our life together in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And also the suggestion of having more folklorama. I hope this could go a long way in bringing various cultural communities together in order to understand the varieties that we bring together, the diversity that we bring together. Unlike the leader of the South, we do strongly believe in diversity here in the North. So with this couple of thoughts, let me also pay our respect and tribute to late Minister of Education Alon Altama, and we have met in a couple of occasions. I deeply respect the former minister with who I interacted about our project, Extremism and Radicalization Prevention in Manitoba. And he was so eager to listen more. And actually, our project coordinator, Linda, met him in his office. And we have posted the discussion in our website, www.erim.ca. You can always watch what he thought. And his contribution would go further in enriching our lives and fight against hatred and extremism. So with these couple of words, thank you once again. Stay well, stay safe, and stay vigilant. Otherwise, we will be defeated by extremists within us. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.